The rain had just begun when Sheriff Halpern first saw the trail, thin as a knife cut, slicing between the trees where no path had ever existed before. The storm the night before had torn through the county like something alive, ripping up roots older than memory itself. Now the forest floor lay strangely exposed, as though the land had coughed up a secret it had been forced to swallow decades ago. He stepped closer, the air thick and cold, carrying the kind of silence that presses against your ears. No birds. No rustling. Just the wet drip of rain sliding off twisted branches. It was supposed to be a routine sweep, nothing more. But the moment he noticed the footprints, small, bare, and impossibly fresh, his breath caught in his throat. They led deeper into the woods, the same woods where the Ashford children had vanished 8 years earlier without leaving so much as a whisper behind. Everyone had given up long ago. Everyone but the forest, it seemed. The deputies behind him shifted uneasily as they followed the trail, each step sinking into the mud as if the earth itself were reluctant to let them go. The deeper they walked, the darker it grew, as though daylight refused to cross a certain invisible line. Then the cabin emerged, half-rotted, leaning like a body that had long lost its strength, its windows black and hollow. No one remembered it being here. No map had ever shown it. It shouldn't have existed at all. Yet smoke curled faintly from the chimney. Sheriff Halpern raised his hand, signaling silence. But the forest was already silent, too silent, holding its breath with them. He pushed the door open, and the smell hit first: damp wood, cold ashes, and something else, something faintly familiar yet deeply wrong. Then he heard it, a soft shuffle, the unmistakable scrape of small feet on the floorboards. And in the corner, huddled together like shadows trying to become human again, were the 3 Ashford children. Alive. Staring. And not blinking. Their skin was pale as winter bark, their hair tangled into wild mats, and their eyes were hollow pools reflecting nothing, as though whatever had lived behind them had been taken or chased away long ago. One of them whispered something under their breath, a sound too soft to decipher yet sharp enough to make every hair on the back of his neck rise. It wasn't a word in any language he knew. As the rain hammered the roof and the forest closed in around the cabin, Sheriff Halpern realized with a cold certainty that finding the children was not the end of the nightmare. It was the beginning. In 1959, when the Ashford children vanished, the disappearance struck the county with a force no one was prepared for. It began like any ordinary afternoon, with the 3 siblings wandering toward the edge of the woods near their home, a place so familiar to them that no one thought twice about it. They had played there hundreds of times before, returning with muddy shoes, scraped knees, and stories of imaginary adventures. But that day felt different in a way no one noticed until it was too late. Their laughter faded into the distance, and by dusk, the silence around the forest felt unusually heavy, as if the trees themselves were holding their breath. When their mother realized the children had been gone longer than they ever had before, a subtle unease began creeping over her, quickly tightening into panic as the sun dipped behind the hills and shadows swallowed the yard. What began as a simple call for the kids to come home turned into a frantic search within minutes. Neighbors joined the effort first, then friends, and soon half the county was combing the woods with lanterns, calling out their names through the dark. But no answering voice echoed back, no sound of small feet brushing through the leaves. The forest remained still, too still, as though it had sealed itself shut around whatever secret it now held. By midnight, the mood had shifted from confusion to fear. It was impossible to imagine all 3 children wandering off so far that they couldn't be found, yet no trace of them, no broken twig, no piece of clothing, not even a footprint, marked the ground. The following days brought the largest search operation the county had ever seen. Trained dogs were brought in, search teams mapped every slope and ravine, helicopters circled above, and volunteers walked shoulder to shoulder through the underbrush. But the woods swallowed every effort just as it had swallowed the children. Stories and speculations began spreading quickly, some logical, others unsettling. People whispered that the forest had always had a strange energy, that animals avoided certain parts of it, that hunters sometimes heard footsteps behind them though no one was there. What began as small-town gossip soon grew into a quiet fear that something unnatural might have happened. After weeks of searching with no progress, hope began to collapse under the weight of dread. Officials eventually scaled back the operation, issuing the heartbreaking statement that the children were presumed dead or lost in a part of the wilderness too remote to survive. It was a moment that left the entire community shaken. The idea that 3 children could vanish without a single clue felt impossible, yet it became a grim reality the town was forced to accept. The case became a wound that never quite closed, a mystery that pressed into the collective memory of the county, leaving everyone with the haunting feeling that the forest had taken something it had no intention of giving back. When the initial shock of the children's disappearance faded and the long days of searching stretched into weeks, a grim realization began to settle over the county: the case was slipping away. What started as a frantic race against time slowly transformed into a quiet, painful acknowledgement that the trail had grown cold. Despite the countless hours spent combing the woods, interviewing neighbors, examining every inch of the Ashford property, and retracing the children's steps, investigators found themselves standing exactly where they had begun, with nothing to anchor the search, no clues to follow, and no direction to turn. The forest that bordered the Ashford home seemed to mock their efforts, its dense shadows swallowing every hope of discovery. Even the most experienced trackers admitted they had never encountered a disappearance so complete, so absolute, that it felt as though the children had been lifted out of existence rather than merely lost. As the weeks drifted into months, the emotional temperature of the county changed. The community, once filled with restless determination, began to retreat into a state of exhausted resignation. Posters with the children's faces still clung to telephone poles, fading from sun and rain until the edges curled and colors bled. The search parties that once marched through the woods in long, determined lines now dwindled to small groups of volunteers who ventured out only on weekends, fueled by a thin thread of hope that never fully snapped. Families returned to their routines, though no one felt entirely comfortable doing so. There was an unspoken understanding that something terrible had happened, something that carried a heavy presence even if it remained unseen. Investigators, too, felt the weight of failure closing in. Their case files grew thicker with reports that led nowhere and interviews that circled back on themselves. Every theory they built crumbled under scrutiny. The possibility of abduction left no evidence. The idea that the children had wandered further than expected conflicted with the lack of any physical trace, and the darker speculations, the ones whispered only in late-night meetings, provided no answers at all. Eventually, the lead investigator made the decision no one wanted to confront: the official search would be scaled down. It was a formal admission that the case had reached an impasse, and for many locals, it felt like an abandonment of the children themselves. Slowly, the disappearance of the Ashford siblings shifted from an urgent crisis to a haunting legend whispered about at kitchen tables and late-night gatherings. Parents warned their own children not to wander too close to the woods, teenagers dared each other to explore the edges at dusk, and the town learned to coexist with the lingering ache of unanswered questions. The woods remained silent, untouched, and indifferent, and the case slipped into the kind of coldness that felt final, the kind that sinks deep into a community's bones and refuses to fade. In the years following the disappearance of the Ashford children, the county tried to rebuild a sense of normalcy, but the woods did not let the memory fade so easily. Strange reports began surfacing, quiet at first, shared in hushed tones by hunters returning early from their trips or hikers who refused to finish their usual trails. They spoke of fleeting shapes darting between the trees, small and fast, almost human in outline but moving in a way that unsettled the senses. These figures never approached anyone directly, always watching from a distance, just close enough to be noticed but far enough to remain uncertain. Most people dismissed the stories as tricks of the light or the woods playing on the mind, especially knowing how deeply the disappearance had scarred the community. Still, the sightings continued, persistent enough to stir unease among even the most skeptical residents. As more stories emerged, a strange pattern formed. Those who claimed to see something described the figures as child-sized and thin, sometimes crouched behind fallen logs or peering around tree trunks. A few reported hearing soft footsteps behind them, light as if made by bare feet, but whenever they turned, there was nothing but the stillness of the forest. One hunter swore he heard quiet, breathy voices whispering from the underbrush, as though children were trying to speak but couldn't quite form the words. He left the woods immediately and refused to return, insisting that no animal sounded like that. Though the local sheriff's office entertained a few of the reports, They ultimately chalked them up to nervous imagination fueled by a tragedy the town had never truly recovered from. What made the sightings harder to ignore was their consistency across people who had never spoken to one another. Two fishermen on opposite sides of the county described seeing small silhouettes perched in the branches of old pine trees, watching silently before vanishing into the leaves. A group of teenagers on a camping trip claimed they saw eyes reflecting light from the fire, too low to be a deer, too close to be safe, yet no creature stepped forward to reveal itself. Even more unsettling were the accounts of faint laughter echoing through the woods just before dusk, soft and distant, disappearing the moment anyone tried to follow it. Parents began warning their children not to wander near the forest edge, not because they believed in monsters, but because too many adults were quietly troubled by what they had heard. Despite the increasing number of reports, no one found any physical evidence to support them. No tracks. No broken branches. No clothing remnants. Nothing that could be investigated. It created a disturbing sense of something present yet untouchable, something that existed just out of reach. Bit by bit, these sightings turned into a whispered belief shared around the county. The woods had not forgotten the Ashford children. And perhaps, in some strange and silent way, the children were still wandering inside it. The storm that tore through the county in early 1967 was unlike anything the locals had seen in decades. Winds howled so violently that even the oldest pines bent as though bowing to some invisible force, and lightning cracked open the sky with a relentless fury that made windows rattle through the night. When it finally passed, the town awoke to a landscape that looked unsettled, branches scattered across roads, fences splintered, and whole trees ripped from the ground as if they had been plucked by a giant hand. Yet amid all the destruction, it was the forest bordering the Ashford property that revealed the most unsettling change, one no one anticipated. A cluster of massive trees, older than many of the county's oldest residents, had been uprooted entirely, their tangled roots jutting upward like skeletal limbs. In the place where they had stood, now lay a narrow, unnatural trail that had never existed before. Early that morning, a pair of park rangers inspecting the storm damage stumbled upon the newly exposed path. They had walked the forest countless times and knew its layout as well as the lines on their palms, but this trail was unfamiliar in a way that made them instinctively uneasy. It cut sharply between the trees in a winding line, as though something had carved its way through the undergrowth deliberately rather than by accident. The soil was oddly clear, as if footsteps had pressed into it long before the storm, only to be hidden beneath the heavy canopy of trees until nature tore that cover away. The rangers exchanged uneasy glances, both aware of the dark history connected to these woods, yet hesitant to voice it out loud. The disappearance of the Ashford children was still a bruise the county carried quietly, even 8 years later. Word of the strange discovery spread quickly. Sheriff Halpern arrived later that afternoon to survey the trail himself, and the moment he saw it, a cold heaviness settled in his chest. The path looked wrong, not simply new, but out of place, as though it belonged to something that had slipped in between the layers of time without permission. It snaked deeper into a section of the forest that locals avoided even in broad daylight, a place where compasses sometimes faltered and where stories of strange shapes and unsettling whispers had grown increasingly common in recent years. Standing at the mouth of the trail, the sheriff felt an inexplicable sense of being watched, though there was nothing but the still, damp silence of the storm's aftermath. The discovery reignited old fears in the town. People whispered that the storm hadn't just revealed the trail, it had forced something hidden into the open. Some believed the path had always been there, buried under the roots of the ancient trees, waiting for the right moment to be uncovered. Others feared it was a sign that whatever had taken the Ashford children all those years ago had left this trace behind, now exposed for reasons no one fully understood. Whatever the explanation, the trail marked a turning point, dragging the long-cold mystery of the missing siblings back into the present with a force that left the entire county unsettled. Following the narrow trail uncovered by the storm, Sheriff Halpern and his team moved cautiously into the depths of the forest, each step sinking into wet soil, each breath filled with the damp scent of rotting leaves. The deeper they went, the more the world behind them seemed to fade. The air grew colder, the trees taller, and the silence heavier, as though sound itself refused to travel within those woods. After nearly an hour of following the winding path, the forest abruptly opened into a small clearing, an area no local map had ever shown, a place no one in the county knew existed. And at the center of that clearing stood a small, decaying cabin, its wood darkened with age, roof sagging, windows shattered or boarded from the inside. It looked abandoned, forgotten, and yet disturbingly intact, as though whatever lived there never intended to be found. The first thing that struck the officers was the faint trail of smoke rising from the crooked chimney. It curled upward into the grey sky like a thin whisper, too deliberate to be an accident. Sheriff Halpern felt a cold shiver crawl down his spine. A storm strong enough to tear apart the forest had not extinguished the fire. Someone, or something, had been inside recently. The team approached the door, weapons drawn, their nerves stretched tight. The wooden boards beneath their boots creaked in protest, sending echoes across the clearing that sounded too loud in the oppressive stillness. When the sheriff pushed the door open, it groaned like a wounded animal, revealing a dim interior lit only by the weak glow of embers smoldering in a stone fireplace. What they saw inside froze them in place. 3 small figures huddled in the far corner of the room, motionless, crouched together as though trying to merge with the shadows. At first, the officers thought they were staring at dolls or mannequins, abandoned and left to decay. But then one of the figures lifted its head, and the weak light from the fire caught the pale curve of a cheek and the dull shine of an eye. The Ashford children, missing for 8 long years, were alive. Their faces were gaunt, their hair long and tangled, their skin bleached to an unnatural pallor as if they had not seen sunlight in years. They did not cry, did not speak, did not even flinch at the arrival of strangers. They simply stared, wide-eyed and unblinking, as though unsure whether the people entering the cabin were real or another part of a nightmare. The room around them offered no answers. No food. No clothing. No signs of recent human life besides the fire. It was as if the children had materialized out of thin air, trapped in a place that resisted explanation. Their presence felt impossible, fragile, and deeply wrong, as though the forest had been keeping them hidden for reasons it did not intend to share. The discovery should have brought relief, but instead it plunged every investigator into a deeper, darker uncertainty because nothing about the scene made sense, and the children's hollow, fearful eyes suggested a truth far more disturbing than the mystery of their disappearance. Explores the unsettling shift in the family's behavior once the twins' abnormalities grew impossible to hide, revealing how fear, shame, and desperation began to consume every decision the parents made. As the children grew older, even basic routines like eating, sleeping, or playing became unpredictable, filled with strange habits and sudden changes that terrified anyone who witnessed them. Their eyes held an unnatural alertness, as if they sensed things before they happened, and their reactions were too sharp, too fast, too knowing for their age. At first, the parents tried convincing themselves that the twins were simply different, perhaps gifted or unusually observant, but the incidents piling up around the house made denial impossible. Lights flickering when they entered a room, animals refusing to come near them, and sudden cold drafts appearing whenever they became upset forced the parents to question everything they believed. What frightened them even more was the eerie connection the twins shared, communicating without speaking, reacting at the same exact moment, and sometimes staring at each other for minutes with a strange, unblinking intensity. The mother began to watch them secretly, hoping to catch some logical explanation, but instead found them performing synchronized movements, whispering in a language she didn't recognize, or drawing symbols on the floor that neither parent taught them. The father grew increasingly paranoid, insisting they move to a different town or consult someone who understood the supernatural, but fear of judgment and humiliation kept them trapped in silence. Neighbors started noticing the strange atmosphere surrounding the house, shadows moving behind curtains, lights turning on at odd hours, and unsettling sounds that seemed to come from the attic. Rumors spread quickly, forcing the family to isolate themselves even further, shutting doors, avoiding visitors, and refusing to let the children leave the property. With every passing day, the twins' influence over the household deepened, as if they drained the life out of the once warm home. Their moods dictated the energy of the entire place. When they were calm, the air felt normal, but when they cried or grew agitated, the house seemed to react, creaking, vibrating, or shifting in ways that defied explanation. The parents, exhausted and terrified, attempted to regain control by enforcing rigid routines, but the more they tried to manage the twins, the more unpredictable and powerful their strange behaviors became, turning the home into a maze of tension and silent dread. Focuses on the moment the parents finally realized that whatever was happening with their twins was no longer something they could hide, control, or rationalize, and that the situation had crossed a boundary that felt dangerous in a way they had never imagined. It began with small, unexplainable episodes that escalated into events so disturbing that even the most grounded, skeptical person would have felt fear crawl up their spine. One night, the mother woke to the sound of both twins laughing in perfect harmony, a sound too synchronized to be natural, echoing through the halls with a sharpness that made her blood run cold. When she entered their room, she found them sitting upright on their beds, eyes wide open, staring at the exact same point on the wall as if watching something invisible. Their laughter stopped instantly when she stepped inside, replaced with an eerie silence that felt heavier than the darkness in the room. Moments like this became more frequent, each one chipping away at the parents' ability to pretend everything was normal. The father began noticing that whenever he tried speaking about the twins' behavior, the house would react, lights dimming, objects shifting slightly, or doors creaking open as though warning him to stay silent. The tension grew unbearable when the twins began finishing their parents' sentences, repeating conversations they were never present for, or predicting things moments before they happened. Their presence alone altered the atmosphere, making the parents feel watched even when the children weren't in the room, as if an unseen force lingered around them. The turning point came during an argument between the parents about seeking help. The mother insisted they needed professional intervention, someone who understood strange behavioral phenomena, while the father feared exposing the truth would make them targets of judgment or worse. In the middle of their argument, the twins appeared in the doorway, completely silent, their expressions blank yet unsettlingly aware. Without saying a word, they walked toward their parents, stood between them, and stared up with identical eyes that reflected no emotion. In that moment, the parents felt something shift, an unspoken message, a quiet warning, a realization that the twins weren't simply observing the world but influencing it in ways beyond their understanding. From that night onward, every sound, every shadow, every breath in the house carried a weight that reminded them they were no longer just parents raising children, they were people living alongside something they feared they might never fully understand. Centers on the moment investigators finally uncovered the journals hidden deep inside the Ashford family's abandoned shed, journals that revealed far more than anyone expected and shifted the entire direction of the case. The discovery happened almost by accident when one of the deputies, frustrated by days of dead ends, kicked aside a pile of rotting boards and noticed a loose floor panel beneath them. The panel lifted with almost no resistance, as if someone had opened and closed it many times before, and underneath lay a small wooden box wrapped in decaying cloth. Inside the box were 4 journals, each one marked with a different year leading up to the children's disappearance. The pages were brittle, stained by moisture and time, but the writing remained disturbingly clear, the handwriting almost frantic in some places, perfectly controlled in others. As investigators began reading, they realized the journals were written by the mother, documenting her growing belief that something was wrong with the woods behind their house, something she had tried to explain to her husband but could never put into words without sounding unstable. She wrote about hearing whispers that didn't belong to any person, seeing faint shapes moving between the trees at dusk, and finding her children standing outside in the middle of the night with their eyes closed, as if listening to something calling them. The deeper investigators read, the more unsettling the entries became. The mother described the children waking up with dirt under their fingernails even after she locked the doors, drawing strange symbols on the floorboards without remembering doing it, and speaking in tones that didn't sound like their voices. She noted that the children often claimed they saw things in the woods, things she could never find when she investigated, though she always felt watched while searching. In the final entries before the disappearance, her writing grew shaky, sentences breaking apart as if she were writing while trembling. She described the children becoming distant, unresponsive, and emotionally detached, spending hours staring into the forest as if waiting for something. One entry mentioned hearing footsteps outside their bedroom even though no one else was awake. Another hinted that the mother feared the children were being lured by something she could not understand. The chilling part came when investigators reached the last page, where she wrote that she had finally realized the woods didn't simply want to frighten her or her family, they wanted her children, and she feared she had waited too long to stop whatever had already begun. focuses on the unnerving experiences that the investigators themselves began to endure after discovering the Ashford children, experiences that blurred the line between reality and something far darker than they had anticipated. From the moment the children were taken into protective custody, strange occurrences began at every location associated with the case. At the cabin, officers reported hearing footsteps echoing through the empty rooms, soft and deliberate, stopping as soon as anyone tried to follow the sound. Shadows seemed to move independently of the light, flitting across walls and ceilings, and the temperature in certain areas dropped abruptly, leaving frost forming on windowsills even in the middle of a warm afternoon. Those tasked with cataloguing evidence found their notes mysteriously altered, with words and symbols appearing that had no origin in their own handwriting, some resembling the strange drawings found in the children's journals. One investigator described waking at 3 in the morning to the sound of whispering voices just outside the bedroom window, voices that spoke in tones both familiar and alien, always ceasing the moment he tried to call for help. Others reported feeling a constant pressure on their chests, as though someone or something was observing them from just beyond perception, a presence invisible yet undeniably close. These experiences escalated over time. Investigators who had been skeptical at first began to fear even entering the children's temporary quarters, claiming that the twins would sit silently in corners of the room, staring at them with unblinking eyes that seemed to see far beyond the physical, and that at times, the children appeared to anticipate their movements before they made them. Some officers felt a compulsion to leave the case entirely, reporting nightmares that replayed moments from the investigation with subtle, terrifying alterations, footsteps that should not have been there, shadows forming shapes that did not exist, and whispers that hinted at knowledge no human could possess. Even those who dismissed the experiences as stress or fatigue began to acknowledge a growing sense of unease that could not be rationalized. It was as though the children carried an invisible tether to something in the woods, something that extended beyond their physical presence and reached out to anyone who came near. Every new discovery, every attempt to document evidence or interview the children, seemed to draw that presence closer, creating an environment where fear, paranoia, and unease became the unspoken norms. The investigators' own testimonies, once filled with professional detachment, now contained repeated references to being followed, observed, and influenced by a force beyond understanding, leaving them uncertain whether they were documenting reality or slowly being drawn into the same unexplainable phenomenon that had claimed the children in the first place. Explores how, despite the shocking discovery of the Ashford children and the unnerving experiences of the investigators, the case was ultimately sealed, leaving an enduring sense of fear and unanswered questions that continued to haunt everyone involved. Once the children were removed from the cabin and placed under protective custody, authorities faced a dilemma they could not reconcile. The children's behaviors remained inexplicably abnormal, their silence and strange reactions confounding psychologists, social workers, and law enforcement alike. Every attempt to document their testimony, examine their living conditions, or recreate the timeline of their disappearance seemed to trigger subtle, unexplainable disturbances, doors creaking when no one was near, shadows shifting unnaturally, and fleeting glimpses of movement just beyond the edges of perception. The investigators, exhausted and increasingly unnerved, began recording these phenomena, yet the reports were treated with skepticism by higher authorities. Officials ultimately decided to classify the case, citing the children's fragile mental states and the lack of concrete explanations as reasons to limit public access. Media inquiries were redirected or denied entirely, leaving the townspeople with fragments of information and an unsettling void where answers should have been. Even within the investigative team, unease lingered. Many officers reported recurring nightmares in which the woods stretched endlessly, populated by dark figures that watched and waited, while others claimed they could feel the children's presence lingering long after leaving the property, as though something unseen had followed them home. Attempts to reopen the case years later met with obstruction and missing evidence, as if someone or something had deliberately erased the trail to prevent further investigation. Despite the official closure, rumors persisted among locals. Some swore they saw the children wandering near the edges of the forest at night, eyes vacant yet alert, while others recounted hearing faint whispers and laughter drifting through the trees. Scholars, journalists, and paranormal investigators who attempted to study the case found themselves frustrated by conflicting accounts, vague police records, and the unwillingness of those involved to revisit the events. The secrecy surrounding the Ashford children became part of the legend itself, a dark shadow hanging over the county and its history. Those closest to the case, officers, social workers, and neighbors, admitted to feeling an ongoing tension, a sense that the mystery was not simply unresolved but alive, a presence that persisted quietly yet insistently. Even decades later, the woods retained a reputation for strange occurrences, and any attempt to recount the story carried a palpable chill. The final, chilling reality was that the Ashford children's ordeal had left a mark far beyond the physical disappearance. The case was officially closed, the files sealed, and the children's lives kept private, but the weight of the unknown, the fear of what had truly happened, and the strange, lingering signs in the forest ensured that the story never truly ended.